Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Professor K. Srinivas from Pondicherry University. I teach philosophy at that university. I am the course coordinator of Religion and Philosophy in the subject Indian Culture. In this module, we are going to take up Sri Aurobindo, and this particular module is very important because Sri Aurobindo is rated as one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, and this module intends to cover the philosophical and spiritual aspects of Sri Aurobindo, evolution, gradations of mind, integral yoga, and the ultimate goal of human evolution according to Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo Acroyd Ghosh, later known as Sri Aurobindo, is one of the gifted philosophers of the Indian subcontinent. He had a thorough Western upbringing and education. He simply brushed aside the conception of Westerners, which dubs Indian culture as a form of occultism or superstition. After his active participation in the freedom struggle for about 10 long years, he moved to Pondicherry, the then French territory, and devoted himself to the study of philosophy, integral yoga, meditation, and spiritual experimentation for about 40 long years, and wrote copiously on these matters until his death in 1950. During his early days in Pondicherry, he was busy with his journal, the Arya, which was published between 1914 to 1920, in which he published extensively on different subjects. This is a picture of Sri Aurobindo when he was young and when he was relatively old. His writings are the living testimony to the people that he concentrated mainly on the Indian culture, civilization, and philosophy extensively, and he reinterpreted some of the cardinal texts of Indian philosophy. For example, these are some of the most interesting and most influential writings of Sri Aurobindo. Essays on the Gita, Synthesis of Yoga, The Human Cycle, The Ideal of Human Unity, and his magnum opus, The Life Divine. Apart from this, there are also 2 volumes of collected poems and his great epic Savitri, which is written in about 27,000 lines. And here you can see some of the titles of the books that Sri Aurobindo wrote. Then coming to the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo, like any other philosopher, Sri Aurobindo has his views on epistemology, metaphysics, social philosophy, psychology, and also soteriology. Let us take up epistemology. What exactly does he want to discuss in epistemology? For example, Sri Aurobindo's metaphysical presuppositions are justified through his epistemological framework. He considers experience in its widest sense in order to accommodate knowledge obtained through different sources of experience. Normally, we restrict experience to sense experience, leaving out all other forms of experience. But in his integral yoga, Sri Aurobindo takes experience in its wider sense and accommodates all forms of experience to have knowledge of highest kind. Hardcore epistemologists confine their experience to mere sense experience. But for Sri Aurobindo, this ordinary sense experience is only a middle part of our existence. And there is a need to transcend this middle path of existence and to recognize the superior form of experience. Therefore, he says, this middle form of experience is sandwiched between subconscious and superconscious spheres. Sri Aurobindo reconstructs the ancient Vedantic conception of reality in its new light to suit the later mentality. For example, both in the Upanishads and in the Bhagavad Gita, the 5 organs of sense, the lower mind, namely the manas, and higher mind, namely the buddhi, are described as the sources of human knowledge. However, the self, which is self-luminous, is placed above these 3. According to Sri Aurobindo, the senses are only the specializations of the outward mind. Perhaps what he meant is the senses only help us in acquiring the knowledge of outer reality or external reality. Their scope is restricted to external reality only. It is mind, out of ignorance, divides the self from the external world. So therefore, the mind is the root cause of this kind of ignorance. The truth is that the self and the external world are one and the same. We need to realize that. Strictly speaking, for him, the mind is the real sense underlying all other senses. Mind has the capacity to work independently of the senses. Well, Sri Aurobindo is very clear with regard to the capacity of mind. Mind is not dependent on senses for its functions. Mind can function independently of the senses. There lies the greatness of human mind according to Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo is not primarily interested to extend the powers of mind to know the nature of phenomenal world. He is more interested in those truths which are beyond sense perception. For example, what exactly does he want to do with the powers of mind or the capacity of mind? The sense organs are capable of providing us with knowledge of the external reality. Therefore, there is no need to employ mind in order to have the knowledge of external world. Therefore, mind can be utilized for something, to grasp something extraordinary or which cannot be captured by ordinary sense organs or sense experience. For instance, an inquiry into the operations of reason reveals that reason has 2 activities to perform. They are mixed and pure. What are the mixed activities and what are the pure activities of reason? In its mixed activity, the reason gathers data of the external world from sense experience in order to interpret and interrelate them to arrive at different kinds of inferences. But reason in its pure form, which is very important for Sri Aurobindo, tries to transcend these ordinary perceptual experiences and strives to arrive at general and unalterable concepts which attach themselves not to the appearances but go beyond the ordinary level of sense experiences. This is the very interesting feature of Sri Aurobindo's conception of reason or mind. So therefore, he tries to provide more emphasis to the pure reason or the pure mind rather than the mixed activity of mind or reason. Now there must be something which is non-sensuous and which verifies all ideas of pure reason. Is such experience possible? That is what he questions. For example, Sri Aurobindo replies to this question in a positive manner. Direct or non-sensuous experience of reality which exists beyond our ordinary sense experience reveals us that this reality is within every one of us in an obscure manner. It can be developed and through proper culture. Sri Aurobindo reminds us that ancient Vedanta seized this message of the intrusion and formulated it in three great declarations of the Upanishads. I am he, thou art that, O Svetaketu. All this is the Brahman, this self is the Brahman. What ultimately Sri Aurobindo tries to tell us here is that there are such extraordinary truths or eternal truths which can be grasped by pure reason or by pure mind. And sense experience and ordinary sense organs wouldn't be in a position to give us the knowledge of such eternal truths. For example, he brings in the notion of intuition as an important source of knowledge of such truths. Intuition is not a process. Normally we say reason is a process, but intuition is not a process. Then what it is? Intuition occurs to us like a flash. For instance, there is a gradual transformation of intuition which results in separative knowledge. First, there is knowledge by identity, which results from our immediate awareness of our self-luminous self. One does not find any sense of separation in this form of knowledge because there is something called self-awareness. We know what we are. And such knowledge is possible because of the self-luminosity of this self. Therefore, there is nothing called separate kind of knowledge. Then there is knowledge by intimate direct contact, when we partly disengage ourselves from the states and observe them while they are continuing. The third type of knowledge by separative direct contact, in which the observer separates himself from the stream of mental states and assumes the role of a witness. Here we find that there is a dualism between the subject and object. Such kind of knowledge is normally the knowledge of ordinary empirical objects. So this kind of classification of knowledge is something unique one finds in the writings of Sri Aurobindo. Now coming to his metaphysics, there is some kind of continuation that one finds between his epistemology and metaphysics. As I have already told you earlier, the metaphysical foundations of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy are proved by his epistemological considerations. Now, in Sri Aurobindo's metaphysics, Sri Aurobindo talks about God, nature, and man's social duties in a synthetic whole. If knowledge has to be genuine in itself, rather the pure knowledge or absolute knowledge is possible, according to Sri Aurobindo, only through higher reason or mind. Such knowledge is technically called integral knowledge, which leads to integral transformation of the human personality. In order to understand this, there is a need to understand his metaphysics, which takes into account his theory of evolution. Now, metaphysics is a very important part of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, and his metaphysics is not detached from his epistemology. The presuppositions of his metaphysics are proved through his epistemological considerations. According to Sri Aurobindo, philosophy is to discover that being by knowing which everything else is known. The supreme reality, according to Sri Aurobindo, is Satchit Ananda, or it can also be called the supramental reality. But this absolute is not an isolated entity, in the sense that we must rationally understand and explain its relation to the ordinary world of experiences, namely the finite world. Now, in this context, there is a need to show how Sri Aurobindo differs from the interpretation given by an Advaitin. The Advaitic interpretation of the Absolute, which is indeterminate, is best beset with some contradictions. According to Sri Aurobindo, how does a pure unity, devoid of all attributes, give rise to the world of appearances or multiplicity? This is the question he raised. If there are no divisions in Brahman, then how come this pure unity, which is bereft of all contradictions or differences, give rise to the multiplicity? This question needs to be answered. The Advaitins put forward the argument that the absolute reality, being pure, is the only reality. The world of empirical existence is only an illusion, mithya. Now, Sri Aurobindo, in his explanation of the absolute reality, rejects the Advaitic conception of the absolute. He believes that although the absolute is indeterminate and transcendent, it is capable of gradual creative self-expression and self-determination. This is where Sri Aurobindo differs from Advaitic interpretation of the absolute. To put it in the words of Sri Aurobindo, it is perfectly understandable that the absolute is and must be indeterminable, in the sense that it cannot be limited by any determination or any sum of possible determinations. but not in the sense that it is incapable of self-determination. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo tries to give a new interpretation to the expression self-determination, self-indetermination rather. The absolute cannot be described in terms of any quality or property, or power further cannot fully explain its nature. Advaitins described the absolute negatively, neti neti, through the method of neti neti. But Sri Aurobindo argues such negation in another way limits the absolute by denying it even the freedom of self-expression and self-determination. This is one of the most important arguments which Sri Aurobindo advanced against the Advaitic conception of the absolute. Sri Aurobindo believes that the absolute is a positive entity and it has its own transcendental logic. There is a greater reason in all the operations of the infinite, but it is not a mental or intellectual. The operations of the absolute are spiritual or supramental in nature. There is logic in it because there are relations and connections infallibly seen and executed in this supramental reason. What is the magic to our finite reason is the logic of the infinite. That means this is what he calls the transcendental logic. Even the transcendental has its own logic. The moment you try to reduce this transcendental logic to formal logic, all our explanations fail, according to Sri Aurobindo. Now, the infinite is ineffable, for it is a harmonious unity of indeterminate, immutable, infinite aspects and is immanent, determinate and dynamic in its finite aspects. The triune nature of the absolute is constituted by pure existence, Sat, pure consciousness, Chit, and pure bliss, Ananda. Perhaps this view of Sri Aurobindo is akin to that of Advaita. Even Advaita Vedanta accepts absolute to be Sat, Chit, Ananda. Perhaps this is the only point of agreement between Advaita and Sri Aurobindo, so far as the absolute is concerned. Now coming to evolution, Sri Aurobindo discussed his views on evolution very systematically in his magnum opus, The Life Divine. In fact, Sri Aurobindo calls his philosophy integral philosophy, and his integral philosophy rests on spiritual theory of evolution. He started that evolution is an important factor in the integral philosophy, and there seems to be no reason why life should not evolve out of material elements or mind out of living forms unless we accept the Vedantic solution that life is already involved in matter and mind in life. I think this is something very radical on the part of Sri Aurobindo, because it is where he locates consciousness in matter, but consciousness in matter is in dormant form. The principle of evolution towards spirit, light and knowledge loses all its significance unless it is assumed that the spirit itself has involved in matter, darkness and ignorance. This tantamounts to saying that evolution necessarily involves involution, the ascent by descent. This is one of the most significant features of Sri Aurobindo's evolution. According to him, unless there is something called involution, the question of evolution does not arise. Therefore, you find this novel concept called involution in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Then, Sri Aurobindo's theory of evolution is a balanced approach based on spiritual and humanistic principles. According to him, spirit, which is supreme reality, is the source of creation and evolution and also the end of realization. The spirit evolves out of matter since it is already implicit in matter. Perhaps what he meant by spirit in this context is nothing but dynamic consciousness. The consciousness is the source of everything for Sri Aurobindo, and this consciousness is the spirit which is there in every object, even in matter. The supreme reality, according to Sri Aurobindo, is Satchit Ananda. It is both stable and dynamic. In other words, it is an integration of being and becoming. Now, it may sound paradoxical sometimes to say, how come it is both being and becoming? It is being, for it is eternal. It is becoming, for it allows matter to come back to its normal state through stages of evolution. And these stages of evolution represent his notion of becoming. But the supreme principle, Satchidananda, being eternal, it can be treated as a being which is stable. Therefore, there is no paradox involved, according to Sri Aurobindo, when he said that the absolute is both being and becoming. Of course, in this picture you can see the stages of involution from Satchidananda to supermind, supermind to overmind, overmind to mind, mind to higher vital, lower vital, substantial physical, subconscient and inconscient. This is the process of involution. Once the spirit reaches its involution, the lowest point of involution, then the evolution starts. Then in the process of evolution, the so-called inconscient becomes a subconscient, then the subconscient transforms into physical, and this physical becomes into subtle physical, then lower vital, then higher vital, mind, overmind, supermind, and finally it reaches the supramental level, namely Satchidananda. Now we have seen the so-called evolution has got a conscious force inbuilt in it. In the absence of such conscious force, which is also technically known as life force or divine Shakti by Sri Aurobindo, which is absolutely responsible and necessary for this evolution to progress, to reach the ultimate step, namely the supramental level or the mind. Then of course, one finds that there are several stages through which the reality gradually veils itself. Maybe there are gradations of reality, and the reality tries to unveil itself, gradually veils itself, and then unveils itself in a what you call phased manner. But all these phases and all these processes become part and parcel of his integral philosophy according to Sri Aurobindo. But none of these phases can be isolated or eliminated from the process of evolution or from the process of evolution to know the nature of the absolute mind or the supramental mind or the ultimate reality called Satchidananda. Once you realize this Satchidananda or the ultimate reality, such a state is technically called by Sri Aurobindo the total realization. Now, of course, another peculiar and most interesting feature that you find in Sri Aurobindo's evolution is his evolution involves a triple process. What is this triple process? The evolution not only heightens, it also widens. But one of the most important features is that it also integrates both this heightening and widening. That is one of the most peculiar features of Sri Aurobindo's evolution. This is the reason why his philosophy is popularly known as integral philosophy or the integral yoga. Now, coming to the integration, Sri Aurobindo tries to show it is a heightening process as it rises onward to higher and higher levels. Matter rises to life and life to mind and so on. Along with the process of heightening, the process of evolution widens also. As soon as a new principle emerges within the old ones, it is given accommodation for its subsistence. The third process in evolution is integration. Every process which is part and parcel of this evolution is taken into account. Therefore, there is something called integration of all these processes. None of the processes is isolated or separated from the process of evolution. Coming to social philosophy, normally we think that a spiritual philosopher has nothing to contribute to society. But this is not true. What is the contribution of Sri Aurobindo to social philosophy? He contributed a lot to social philosophy, which we often neglect to know. For instance, blind adherence to materialism leads to fetishism at the cost of human values. And the rigid pursuit of spiritualism may end up in abstract and empty transcendentalism. It is in the social philosophy of Sri Aurobindo we come across a harmonious blend of these two dichotomous ways. Sri Aurobindo's originality lies in his novel interpretation of the various traditional concepts of philosophy, which are aimed at providing a spiritual base to his philosophy of humanism. That means, as a humanist, as a social philosopher, Sri Aurobindo tries to show there is absolute need to spiritualize our social life. He firmly believes that there is no historical evidence to show that man existed without any society. For example, he tells it is something inconceivable, or rather inconceivable, that man without society and society without man. The primary and fundamental reality and individuals as only its parts are cells. Therefore, society and human beings are inseparable from each other. Then the entire universe, humanity, society, individuals are all the manifestations of supreme reality. Therefore, here in his social philosophy, Sri Aurobindo tries to show that society is not detached from the absolute spirit. In other words, what we call society is nothing but the manifestation of supramental level or the supreme reality. An individual loses his or her identity in isolation from the society in which he or she is born. For the individual needs the support of the society for the expansion of his or her physical, vital, and mental being. That means the growth of an individual or the personality of the individual develops only when an individual is located in the society, not when an individual is isolated from the society. This is how Sri Aurobindo tries to tell us the significance of society, and in the absence of society, an individual loses his or her significance as a human being. Coming to his spiritual humanism, Sri Aurobindo tries to show spiritual humanism not only takes into account the life of the senses, but also rejects the escapist tendencies. What are the escapist tendencies? The individuals who do not want to take part in the socialization process, socio-political activities, that shows that individuals develop a kind of an escapist tendency. His spiritual humanism tries to show the guiding principle of all our social actions is nothing but the absolute spirit or the supramental reality, Satchidananda. Now, according to him, both materialism and spiritualism are complementary, because where does the spiritualism manifest? The spiritualism manifests only in social reality. And the social reality is nothing but the transformation of material conditions. So therefore, spirit and matter cannot be separated, and they do not exist as two watertight compartments according to Sri Aurobindo. Now, of course, a genuine philosophical pursuit is one that aims to discover the spiritual reality by means of which human existence can learn its own law of development and aim at perfection. A true realization of the synthesis of the outer and the inner, the matter and the spirit, would provide a vivid picture of the world and life. The spiritual progress in man contributes to social progress. Similarly, the social progress shows the spiritual heights achieved by man. The vertical progress of man is reflected in the horizontal progress of society. So therefore, matter and spirit, according to Sri Aurobindo, cannot be separated and viewed independently as two watertight compartments, because it is the spirit which motivates our social being or our social life. Therefore, his spiritual philosophy is truly a social philosophy of action. Now, let us sum up his philosophy. As discussed above, Sri Aurobindo provided a radical interpretation of the absolute spirit or the absolute reality by negating what is advocated by Advaita in general. And his absolute reality is both being and becoming. And he does not say that there is no paradox involved in saying that it is being because it is the eternal principle, and it is becoming because this being is responsible for any kind of evolution. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo reconstructs the ancient Vedic conception of reality in its new light to suit the latter mentality. Sri Aurobindo's metaphysics views on God, nature and man's social duties as a synthetic whole is very important and very significant as we studied. And his philosophy is to discover that being by knowing which everything else is known, and that being is nothing but the absolute spirit, or the supramental reality, or the Satchidananda. Now, for more details, you can go through the e-text. The further information with regard to Sri Aurobindo's integral philosophy is known through the discussions from there. Thank you.